Greetings from Mesa United Methodist Church of Albuquerque, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. Our traditional service is at 8:30 a.m. and at 11 a.m. we gather for contemporary worship. More information may be found at our website, mesaviewumc.com. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word.
Our gospel reading this morning comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 20, beginning at verse 19. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. And then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told them, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails and hands in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. And although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." And Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
I'm much impressed that Chris and Muffy are still sitting in the first row, even though they got sucked into the sermon last week. Working through your fear. I greatly appreciate that. Sports stars often end up with great nicknames, especially those who are at the top of their field. There's Walter Payton, known as Sweetness. There's Wayne Gretzky, the Great One. There's Jack Nicklaus, the Golden Bear. But the best nicknames, of course, come from the greatest sport, baseball. There's Stan the Man Musial, Cool Papa Bell, Double Duty Radcliffe. Some nicknames become so famous, like Babe Ruth and Pee Wee Reese and Dizzy Dean, we don't even realize they have other first names that we don't know. But for every great nickname, like Mr. October or Hammer and Hank, are those nicknames that most of them would probably rather forget or never have had gotten in the first place. So we have Luke Old Aches and Pains Appling, Ernie the Schnoz Lombardi, but perhaps the worst belongs to Hugh Mulcahy, whose nickname is Losing Pitcher Mulcahy. Now, if you were to have ever met Mr. Mulcahy, I bet you he would not appreciate it if you called him Losing Pitcher, and he'd be glad if it all just went away. Now, just as a trivia question, if somebody ever asked, Hugh Mulcahy was the first major leaguer who was drafted in World War II. So now you have one little piece of trivia you can ask somebody this week. But just like Losing Pitcher is sort of an unfair nickname to give to somebody, so is the nickname that has been appended to Thomas for more than 2,000 years. He has become the poster boy for doubt, which I don't think is either fair to Thomas or to the conception of the idea of doubt itself. Today we continue in our series looking at the nots of Jesus, those injunctions that Jesus told us not to do. Last week we began talking about how we are called to fear not. But that Jesus is not saying that fear is a sin and we shouldn't live our lives without fear, but that we are to work through our fears, to face them, and rather than say, I can't sit in the front row anymore, say, no, I'm going to boldly do this. Face our fears and move through them. And today we look at the idea of doubt, which has many similarities to that idea of fear and fearing not. And so we try to look at doubt through that story of doubting Thomas. But I'd like to start with a defense of Thomas. And to do that, we really need to go back to the story that happened just before that, and in particular verse 18, just before that verse 19 where Chris began reading this morning. Mary Magdalene has gone to the tomb on the first day of the week, that first Sunday, the first Easter, and she's found that the tomb is empty, so she runs and tells the disciple, and Peter and the beloved disciple don't believe her and run to the tomb and find that it's empty, but we're told they don't understand what it is that's going on. Then Jesus appears to Mary and tells her to go tell the disciples that he's back, that's a paraphrase of what he says, and that he's going to ascend to his Father, and so she goes to tell the disciples what she has seen. But do they believe Mary? Well, in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's very clear. They say they don't believe what Mary has to say. In John's Gospel, she appears to the disciples and says, I have seen the Lord. And while it doesn't say they don't believe her, we immediately then move into verse 19. And there they are on the first night of Easter. They're not out hunting Easter eggs. They're not having a chocolate hangover. They're locked up in a room fearful. That says to me they didn't understand. They didn't believe what Mary had to tell them. Because if they understood that Jesus had actually been resurrected from the dead, I don't think we would find them locked up in a room full of fear. So we have to imagine this story as John presents it to us. The disciples are locked in this room, and suddenly somebody appears in the room. He doesn't come through the door. He's just suddenly there. Now, if it said that happened and they were afraid, then I'd say, okay, that makes total sense. That's a horror movie happening right before us. But Jesus says, peace be with you. Do they react to what Jesus says? No. Do they bow down and worship? Do they say, hey, Mary was right. Why didn't we listen to her? No. They don't do anything. So what does Jesus do? He shows them the holes in his hands and the wound in his side. And then they start rejoicing that Jesus has been raised from the dead. But poor Thomas is not with them. This is what happens when you miss church or even you miss committee meetings thinking they're unimportant. Important things happen and you're not there. That's what happens to Thomas. So the disciples say to Thomas, we've seen the Lord. And does Thomas believe him? No. And his response is, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, unless I put my finger in the marks and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And for that interchange, we label him Doubting Thomas. But pay attention to what's just happened. Mary says to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. Do they believe her? No. When do they believe? It's after Jesus shows them the marks in his hand and the wound in his side. Thomas is not asking for anything more than what the disciples have just seen. That's the setup. So Thomas does exactly the same thing that the disciples have done. So why does Thomas get this label doubter? So here's the first thing to know about this passage. 100% of the disciples were doubters. 100% of the disciples were doubters. Mary in John's Gospel, Mary and the other women in the other Gospels don't believe when they go to the tomb that Jesus had been resurrected from the dead either. All of them are doubters. At least Thomas is honest about what's going on here. Perhaps we should call him Honest Thomas rather than Doubting Thomas. Because he's the only one who says what it is that he needs to uphold his faith. So the other disciples doubt, but they're not strong enough to actually say that they doubt. Maybe they think that they're the only ones. They believe wrongly that everyone else is strong in their faith. Surely they believe in the resurrection. I'm the only one who has this issue. And we do the same thing. We think that everyone else has it together. Everyone else knows the Bible. Everyone else knows how to pray. Everyone else knows all those questions that people have about their faith. And so we have to keep it a secret. And so people come to me and say, is it okay to doubt? Do you ever doubt? Is it okay not to believe that? And they make sure to do it when it's just them and me. They don't do it when they're walking out to worship. Because they don't want to have to admit that they have these doubts in their lives. And by not admitting that, not only do we hurt ourselves in our own faith life, I think we hurt each other. Because it doesn't allow us to strengthen one another. It doesn't allow us to help carry one another's burdens. It doesn't allow for somebody else to share their experience, strength, and hope and say, you know, I've had that same doubt. And I still have that same doubt, or maybe this is what helped me come to a deeper place in my own faith life. 100% of the disciples doubted. So if you have doubts, you're in good company. And just like with fear, I don't think that Jesus here is actually saying that doubt is a sin, because that's how we often think about it. That's how we hear about it, especially in the church. If you're not 100% certain on something, if you don't believe exactly what you're supposed to believe or what others think you're supposed to believe, if you say that you have a modicum of doubt, then there must be something wrong with your faith. In fact, maybe you don't have any faith at all. If you don't have any faith, then clearly you're in trouble, because the opposite of faith is doubt, right? But notice what Jesus does and says to Thomas. The first is to pay attention. It takes a week for Jesus to show back up again with them. So Thomas has to sort of sit in this unknowing for an uncomfortable period of time. Other disciples have seen Jesus, but he hasn't. He said he has this caveat out there. I'm not going to believe unless I see this. And it takes a week for Jesus to come back, which means that sometimes in our search for answers, we have to sit in that uncomfortableness. Sometimes for a short period of time, sometimes for a long time. I have people who often say to me, you know, the first question when I meet God is going to be, because we sit in that unknown for our entire lives. It's an ambiguity that some people struggle with. And I don't think that having that ambiguity is necessarily a bad thing. Because when we understand and can appreciate ambiguity, the better we are dealing not only with our doubt, but with our faith. And the second thing is that while Jesus' response to Thomas is sometimes seen as a rebuke of him, I don't think that's the case. Because when he appears a second time, Jesus' greeting is exactly the same as the first time he appears to disciples. Peace be with you. And then he specifically calls to Thomas. He addresses the elephant in the room. And the key piece of this story says to Thomas, basically, do what you need to do. You said you needed to put your fingers in my hands and you need to put your hand in my side. That's what you need to do, Thomas. Let's go ahead. But notice what Thomas does or doesn't do. He doesn't put his finger in Jesus' wounds or his hand in his side. He never actually touches Jesus. He never does the thing that he says he will have to do in order to believe. That means that his doubt is not as big as he thought it was. And then Thomas's pronouncement about Jesus comes. And this is really the high points of John's gospel. It's been building up to this. I mean, we start at the beginning, John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And John begins telling this story about who Jesus is. And in John's gospel, the proclamation that Jesus is the Messiah happens way early. But Thomas is the first one to make a statement that Jesus, not just with God, and Jesus is God, my Lord and my God. The first profound statement of faith in the Gospel of John comes from Thomas, out of his doubt. So what Thomas's doubt shows us is that while doubt can lead us away from our faith life, if normally that's what's being sought, is reasons not to believe anymore, but more often doubt can lead to faith, and not just any faith, but a deeper faith. A faith that can proclaim Jesus as Lord and God. And I think that can happen because faith is not the opposite of doubt. Last week I quoted from Max Lucado, who said that fear is the perceived loss of control. And so when we lose control, when we're fearful, then we seek out safety and control of those things in order to have something to hold on to, and those can become our God, our purpose, our meaning in life. The same thing is true for faith and doubt. Richard Rohr says the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is control. When we seek assurance and complete knowledge, we're seeking to have control over things. And that doesn't leave much room, actually, for faith. That's what Thomas is really trying to do here as well. He's setting the limit and the standards by which he is going to believe. If I can't do this, if I can't do it, then I can't believe. He's also limiting and controlling God in that request. Now, my doubts often try and do exactly the same thing. I begin thinking about the immensity of our galaxy, estimated 100 billion planets, and then the estimated 100 to 200 billion galaxies beyond ours. And I begin to think, how could there possibly be a God who could oversee all of that? But does that say anything about God, or does that say everything about me? Because what I'm saying is my God's not big enough to oversee 300 or 200 billion galaxies. My God could only be limited to the earth. This says nothing about God. It says everything about me and what I want to believe. The same thing is happening with Thomas. He's saying, I can't believe in the resurrection. I can't believe that God is powerful enough to have done that. So until I see it, I won't believe it. Now sometimes I'll encounter people and they'll say, well, I don't believe in God. And I'll say, tell me about the God you don't believe in. Because more than likely, I don't believe in that God either. So when we're in the midst of doubt, we should do an examination. Ask ourselves, does our doubt have anything to do with God, or does it have everything to do with us? Because often what we need to do is let go of God. Let God be free to be God. And doubt is a way to do that. To help us face the assumptions that we make about who God is that have nothing to do with who God is. Doubt can also cause us to admit that we don't know it all. To say that ultimately God is a mystery. That faith is a mystery. That's what assuredness doesn't understand. And there are people who know or are more sure about everything than I am about anything. And to me, that's not a good or healthy faith. Instead, we need to understand that our conceptions, our knowledge of God grow over time, or at least hopefully they grow over time, that our faith grows and deepens over time, that the God you thought about when you were 5 is not the God you thought about when you were 20. And that God is different than when you were 40, and it might be different than you were 60 or 70 or 90, wherever you are on that scale. Hopefully our knowledge of God has changed over time as we have changed. So we should easily be able to say, to paraphrase Aristotle, the more I know about God, the more I realize how much I don't know. That's not the end of faith. That's the beginning of our faith journey. In our search to know who God is and what God is calling us to do. Now, knowing that we don't know can also lead us away from what's been called the tyranny of self-righteousness. I would say it's the sin of self-righteousness. And it's a sin because it leads to brokenness. Brokenness with each other and brokenness with God, because what self-righteousness says to the world is, I'm right and you're wrong. And because I'm right, God is obviously on my side. Otherwise, God would be wrong. So rather than trying to see where God is, we say, I'm here and God has to be here with me. Reverend Peter Gomes says, a surplus of virtue is more dangerous than a surplus of vice, because a surplus of virtue is not subject to the constraints of conscience. Another way of saying that is moral certitude causes more evil in the world than anything else because there's no check on moral certitude. Unless we show a little doubt and we say, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? Now that's something I say to myself quite often. Because what I read in Scripture is that I, as a pastor, a teacher, will be held to a higher standard when I meet God and I'm judged. And God will say, what were you teaching? Were you leading my flock astray? Or were you doing what I was calling you to do? And so I have to often ask myself, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong and we should actually live our lives without fear or without doubt? And when you ask yourselves, what if I'm wrong? It leads to a position of humility. And humility is a good place to approach the world. Actually, I learned my humility at Harvard, the finest university in the world. See what I did there? Now, can doubt be destructive of faith? Of course it can. But it's entirely dependent upon what we're seeking to get out of our doubt. Again, in my experience, those who left the faith because of doubt have been looking for reasons to get out, or they had been told that everything had to be 100% certain, and when that certitude was shattered, which is easy to happen, it couldn't be put back together again. So if we're searching for certainty, trying to leave all ambiguity behind, it's going to be a search that never gets fulfilled. It's always going to leave us broken. But certainty is not what faith is about. Just like we said last week, we are called in faith to take leaps of faith. Which means we have to step out into the unknown. Martin Luther King Jr. said that faith means taking the first step when you can't see the rest of the staircase. That we have to step into the unknown, not ever having all of our answers satisfied. To be comfortable in that ambiguity. And that's really how Jesus concludes his dealings here with Thomas. After Thomas says, "My Lord and my God," Jesus says to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now that statement is not really made to Thomas. That statement is made to us. Because unless you've had some religious experience that you have not told me about, in which you have encountered the risen Lord when Christ has appeared before you like he does to Paul or the disciples, we haven't seen. And yet we are called to believe. And what Thomas shows us is that Christ is present for him before he believes. Thomas's faith is not dependent upon Christ's presence. Christ is already there before Thomas even makes his proclamation of faith. So just like with Jesus' injunction to fear not, it's not about not fearing, it's about working through that to what God is calling us to do. So it's not really about not doubting, because I can think not doubting leads to even more problems. But it's instead to see our doubts as a way to deepen our faith, to ask those questions. Now, there are people who say there's no such thing as stupid questions. I disagree with that. Tomorrow, taxes are due. If you call up the IRS and say, "Would you like to audit me?" that's a stupid question. So there are stupid questions. But we should be questioning in our faith, in order to deepen our faith, in order to expand our understanding of who God is, so that we move from just believing in God to walking with God, living with and in God. So do doubt and faith go together? Yes. You can believe in Jesus and doubt at the same time. You can be faithful and not understand everything you think you're supposed to know. Doubting is part of what it means to be human. And I believe that doubts can strengthen our faith. But we have to be honest about our doubts because, Thomas at least is honest about what he needs. God can't meet us where we want to be. We can't say, if I can only get my faith here, once I read the entire Bible, then God will accept me. God can only meet us where we are. Which means we have to be honest with God. We have to be honest with each other. So be honest with God. Be honest in your small groups. Be honest with your spouses and your friends and say, I'm having some issues here. And walk this journey together, deepening our faith together. Because the most important thing to remember about this story is it's not about Thomas's doubt, really. And it's not about a rebuke or a reprimand. This is a story of hope and of presence and of promise. That hope is possible and Jesus is present. Even before Thomas knows that he's there, believes that he's there, Christ is present. Because Easter is not about the fact that the tomb was empty. It's not about the fact that the burial clothes were nicely folded up and left on the bench. It's about the power and the presence of Christ and blessings for those who have not seen and yet believe. That's us. To know that Christ is present for us, with our doubts, through our doubts, and in our faith. I pray that it will be so, my brothers and sisters.